Um, Welcome back. Thank you again, Barbara, for this wonderful talk. And we'll have a brief conversation, discussion about it. I thought it might be good just for you to begin by talking about how you came to Heinrich Blücher and what's, I know you've listened to some of his lectures in the Common Course. You've read the lecture that has been published. What's your, there's a constant debate that one hears about how much Blücher influenced Hannah Arendt, what their relationship was. I mean, not that it matters to me in some way, but I'm wondering where you put Blücher as, how you see him. Is he part of a creative couple? Is he a writer? Is he a thinker? How do you imagine him? How do you think of Heinrich Blücher after all this time spent reading his work?
I think he must have been very bright and alert to thinking, and that he was very much a people's person. He must have loved to be in conversation, even though later on he didn't like to go to events when Hannah Arendt was invited to speak. He preferred very often to stay at home. But in his earlier years, he must have enjoyed being in conversation, and as you said, with his more political past, where he must have been this communicator and thinking with people rather than, I would say, yes, they were a creative couple, and that's part of my intention to not show them as competing. They must have been very different, that he was a teacher, and the fact that he didn't publish anything or pretended not to be able to write. Whatever.
Pretended, yeah.
I mean, to me, that's, I think if this was his attitude, and as I said before, maybe he was too much in the shadow of this amazingly productive, bright Hannah Arendt, who had from early on, she was so premature and so well read that he must have tried to meet her, grow up to her. And yet, sometimes I've asked my question, I still ask myself that question. She was such a good-looking, networking, bright, well-traveled woman. She had a choice to live his life with pretty much anyone. But she decided to live with Heinrich Blücher, who came from a working-class family, was very direct. There must have been this intellectual inspiration.
Just one, you gave some quotes in the section of your presentation on ideology, right? And the quotes were all about National Socialism and racism. Arendt, as you know, talks about National Socialism and racism, but also talks about Bolshevism and sort of classism, and I'm just wondering, Blücher as a former Spartacist, communist, socialist, did he develop a critique of ideological through socialism and not? How did they relate on that issue?
Well, I would say that he was, after his first years, he was in this section of these Versöhners, so he was critical of the whole movement.
The reconcilers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So he was not just political. There was that he reflected upon where in this party movement or in this socialist movement what he could still justify. And I think that's why.
Did he teach about socialism?
No.
No.
He's really in his teaching, it's philosophy of art and basic philosophical thinking. So after these, it's a complete switch from these essays of 1943, 1949 are about like creating, like working through his past. And I no doubt that was the early years of their relationship did that and feed into origins of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Did I remember correctly that like some of his friends and former comrades also were persecuted in the show trials, and that in Russia in the 30s, and that this was an important thing that turned him away, so to speak, from the ideology. And you remember something like that. I don't know if you came across anything around.
It rings a bell, but I'll give you a
I could, with regard to Roger's question, I'm reminded of that what happened in Russia, of course, was crucial, I think, for his development also with regard to the way he saw socialism, the way he saw the ideologies, and the way he saw how do you want to talk about this?
I would think, just following that for both Arendt and Luker, that it impacts the way they see the United States, right? I mean, which is so. I keep thinking of this phrase that you said that when they finally emigrate, that they were out of a period of life threat. And I'm thinking of these in the Arendtian categories of the kind of or philosophical categories of necessity, where in a way they satisfy that basic bodily safety and material stability when they get to the U.S. And
on top of not only having to flee Germany, but after this ordeal under the Vichy government in France, it's incredible that they could. I keep admiring this being together and sticking it through and really starting from scratch after this experience.
But I find it so interesting. I guess this also goes to both Roger and Thomas's question that, I mean, obviously he came from a semi-materialist background if he was raised, sort of educated through Marxism, and then he really turns towards what you're calling a kind of almost like a pure philosophy or a very idealist thinking through categories and teaching to think in the classroom. I just think that's such an interesting trajectory.
It's like almost they're crossing roads.
Yeah, she's moving out.
She is coming from that background, and again and again, which is why I wanted to quote from this Boston Centennial speech, that she's more into, I want to have an impact in this, in the political realm.
Although through thinking and writing, not through acting.
Yeah.
I mean, very rarely, when she's helping with the saving of Jewish children in Paris.
Yeah. She must have been very, sending packages with, she must have been a good friend in that sense.
She sent packages to Jaspers after the war and other people. But not an actor. I mean, in the sense that, very rarely does she act in politics herself.
And she, there's, this quote of hers where she says, teaching would distract me from writing. So thinking comes first.
So interesting. I'm curious, did you find a similar kind of like pairing in the other creative couples, a kind of public figure, a private figure, a actor, and a more like cerebral?
First of all, most times he is a more prominent figure.
Interesting.
With the exception of Arthur Miller, Marilyn Monroe, that's about on eye level, and yet we know that she is the weaker personality. But in most other cases, think of Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Hardwick. Does anybody know what she has written, who she really is, or Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner? It's taken decades before she was discovered, and it was self-understood for her that she would devote a few years of her life to him having a career. And this is with Arendt and Blücher, the dynamics is the other way around.
Yeah.
But he keeps, for the correspondent, he keeps taking care of negotiating with her publisher and sending her reviews of her books and maintaining a stable home basis.
With regard to...
While she's
Oh, sorry.
doing things as not only taking care of the male, and we all know that he's a womanizer, and having his own secret life, which is partially why we don't know that much about him. There's these two autobiographical texts that he had to write for his naturalization. And other than that, it seems that at least the story with this relationship with Charlotte Billon is kind of within a great big cloud.
With regard to the way they talk about their relationship, I was taken by the quote that you chose for the motto or subtitle, "Endless are the possibilities of the thoughtful heart," that he writes to her, wahrscheinlich das denkende Herz.
Das Verstehende.
Das verstehende Herz. Okay.
I tried to make it
Why
as
why not the understanding heart?
But
well, because this
A little more romantic.
but how are you reading this phrase of verstehende Herz and thoughtful heart on the same time?
the term verstehen reoccurs in her correspondence, and it's very much this process. You can never get there. You can never get to the final point of this is the truth. Which is, I also think, why didn't he write the endless are the possibilities of the loving heart? No, it's this process of thinking together.
So maybe the gerund is important here.
Yes.
Verstehend is a
Yes.
Gerundium.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and also it's a cognitive process rather than an emotional. Even though there are really amusing parts in the early correspondence which have not been published, when he is really very flirtatious and convincing her that she has to buy this fur that they must have talked about, and he is really going out of his way to make it funny, and so that part is also there.
Where are these letters?
The Library of Congress.
And this is not published in their correspondence?
That's correct. I mean, there are lots of dots. And some passages I thought to myself, why is it not worth publishing? It gives me a picture of his personality, that he was very playful and creative.
Are there still a lot of people left who were at their famous New Year's parties or knew them through dinner parties that you're talking to, or
I haven't.
is that part of what you're gonna? Is that part of your research, or are you
Well,
sort of?
if anybody is still alive, I wouldn't know who is. If you know of anyone.
Well,
yeah.
there's some, yeah.
You mentioned the lady who took a class with him.
Yeah, I think I told you the woman I'm renting from
Right.
took a class, was in one of Luker's freshman seminars.
I mean, a lot of her students, their students, and Bruker's students, are still around.
Well, Richard Bernstein is still around. He was a friend of theirs.
Unless you need to run, right?
I need to go, sorry, I have a meeting at 1:30.
Is it 1:30?
It's 1:25.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ava, or
Yeah.
you have any thoughts?
Good to meet you. So, what's the time?
1:25.
1:25, okay. Any thoughts? All
Or Eva, you were here?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you also spoke about the ideologies, which I thought was very interesting, especially with people coming from this more communist background. How was it for them to arrive in the United States? Of course, this must have been an oasis of freedom, of course, but in a way, did they foresee or did they see that another form of ideology could become or could be a big part of their life as well, of society as well? So not ideology, how do you say, as an opposite to the communist ideology, that perhaps they saw the American way of life, the more capitalist way of life as a form of ideology as well, or did they just consider that as part of the freedom that was
I think
here?
the priority, McCarthy, of course, was on their mind, and yet I think that Arendt at least was really focused on this is the Constitution, and this democratic country is ruled not by persons but more ruled by law. That was her idea, and that was the great big difference to what she had experienced, and not only in the Germany that she was exposed to, but also looking into history. So I think she must have been so optimistic and grateful for that form of frame of a society.
It's interesting now because the last 50 years in America has all been reframing our society as this ideology of oppression and of selfishness and so on. Yet the Europeans arriving from the real warring ideologies of communism and National Socialism, this was almost like not an ideology but just a structure. And that's also how Einstein felt. So I wrote this book about Einstein, and he was also, came in 1933, fleeing the Nazis, and he had not that much respect for American culture, to say the least. But he thought, these people are just solid. They've got these rules and they elect people, and it's just it's great. They've somehow figured out how to not have these big ideological, of course, things have changed. But, so he didn't sort of didn't rail against capitalism or anything like that in his letters, even though he was very progressive and, supported Black American rights and stuff like that. So I think at that point wasn't this sort of, because probably Marx had critiqued capitalism and they saw what had happened to Marxism, maybe they were less likely to decry American culture as this evil structure.
Well, not specifically as evil, but I could imagine if they're so well aware of the power of ideologies that they might have been on a very early stage aware of the fact that something that seemed to be the law or just a structure could also be the result of an ideology, because it's so ingrained in their thinking. I could imagine that was a way how they would think about it. But,
Barbara mentioned this speech she gave in 1975 at the Bicentennial, which is published under a number of titles: Home to Roost, and Lying in American Thought. What was the title of your three books?
Lies is the way of life.
Lies is the Way of Life.
yeah.
And in that essay, and in a number of the essays she writes in the late 60s, she begins thinking about the intellectual classes in the United States as coming under an ideology of technocratic professionalism, that she worries is a lying ideology where you get caught up in your own expertise and you lose sight of the facts because you can theorize them away. And she says this is the greatest threat to American democracy. And she actually predicts in a footnote to her essay on violence that the great threat in America would be a racialized war between the elites, the technocratic elites, and the non-elites, and that this is the real danger that America is facing. And, you know, I think if you look, that was written in 68, 67, if you look 45, 50 years later, in many ways, much more so than race, education and elitism is the fulcrum point dividing the country, and the ideologies around that. And so I think that, and I have to imagine that I don't know, this would be an interesting question for you, Barbara, is to what extent Blucher and his sort of non-educated background contributed to Arendt's. I mean, we know Arendt was suspicious of intellectuals because of what happened to her in Germany, and she saw all these intellectuals join the Nazi Party, including her former lover, and
how she was fighting.
And how she was fighting with it. And so she was always skeptical of intellectuals, and was throughout her life scathing in her assessment of other intellectuals. But I have to imagine that was part of her attraction to Blucher, and must have been part of something of their raison that kept them exciting with each other, is that they both were very suspicious of elites. And I'm wondering to what extent that's come up in your work or research.
Maybe to the extent that I find it amazing that they were primarily friends with artists and writers, not so much with the academia.
Yeah.
They could have been close friends with all these well-known Jewish philosophers. They knew them, but as close friends. I think that speaks to the fact that they were more into human relationships, being connected with. It's also part of an extensive part of the correspondence is devoted to thinking about how their friends are doing, in a very caring way, aside from discussing politics.
Are there very clear disagreements between them about sort of anything? Are they debating in these about any sort of core principles or that you came across where they're really at odds?
I've thought about that quite a bit, because it would seem very unlikely that they didn't. That they are really listening to each other and coming from different angles, but I can't point to.
I think one of the things that stuck with me also is the quote you chose from Blucher, and I'm not even really sure what it means, and I feel like the idea that everything we do involves an ethical and moral decision, and how this is wrapped up in, for him, with the idea of the academic as absolutely free, which, I mean, seems such a potent topic right now, where ideas of academic freedom, and there's like an op-ed in the New York Times today about tenure, and he just seemed to find, it's just, his whole situation is so contradictory, right? Because there's no way today that he would even be able to step into a classroom. He has no credentials, right? And yet he sees the academy as really the absolute space, right, of thinking. And even though he seems to be disavowing a political engagement, he sees it as a highly ethical and moral space.
Yeah.
So I just want to highlight that to me just seems really fascinating, and I feel like thinking that with Arendt is probably very productive. Like, what is that difference for him? Like, what is the content of the ethical for him there Is it
Well,
just the preservation of this space?
Well, I think that his moral stance has to do with this. I want you students to be free and to decide how you can be responsible. And I think that's,
Okay.
it's a different way to the exactly same goal.
Okay, so he really sees the classroom as an ethical space.
Yeah.
Of
And also the
Yeah.
way in which he's teaching. I mean, he's constantly, he's not going through his lecture in a method, he doesn't seem to have a very structured way. It's by association. And in particular by asking questions again and again. And like, I can see that person in a classroom really engaging the students. And he is not an academic in the sense. With Hannah Arendt, you know where she takes her references, what her references are. And he takes what he needs from philosophy and literature and art. And oftentimes you can guess where it comes from, and it's not in any way a structured academic education.
there also seems to be something so ephemeral in a way, because he didn't write like the way that you were talking about performance, right? That it was in the moment and almost improvisational or something, and then you had to be there.
There's one, I mean, I don't know if you've read the interview that I did with Jack Blum that's published in that book, Thinking in Dark Times. But Jack Blum was Heinrich's one of his best students, or favorite students. And when Heinrich died, Jack was the one that gave the eulogy at Bard, at the service. But he tells a great story that when he was a student at Bard, he once went to visit Heinrich in New York at Riverside Drive at the apartment. And he went to visit his professor. And he sort of knew that his professor was married to a famous woman, but, you know, he was visiting Heinrich. And he came in, Hannah Arendt opened the door in an apron, and she would bring out tea and cookies while Heinrich was meeting his student. And he was just so taken that this great philosopher was sitting there in the house with tea and cookies and an apron, serving, you know, him and Heinrich. And it just strikes me that that was sort of an amazing part of their relationship.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's
Well, she must have just very much enjoyed to host.
Yes.
Host friends or people, so there was space for conversation.
Very much so.
Which is a great attitude.
Yeah.
Like a different kind of Jewish salon.
Yeah. But about this teaching, I mean, another story that Jack has told me is he used to teach over at what's it called, Bard Hall. That's where he used to teach.
Yeah, that would have been one of my questions here on campus. Where did he teach?
And apparently what Jack says is that his courses were so popular, students would like climb on the rafters and hang listening to his lectures.
Can you imagine?
You know, I mean, trying to fit into Bard Hall, which is a very small little building. And
That's a
they were
great
supposedly
story.
just absolute events on campus.
That's very interesting that, you know, I think that that tradition has sort of decayed a little bit of these wonderful performance lectures, but it was still there when I was an undergraduate. And I don't know if you know this philosopher, but since you did yours, do you know Roberto Unger?
Of course.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I took his course, and no notes, and he starts, in the last class we saw that the rotting of the, you know, the liberal idea, and it was all perfect, there were no ums or ahs, and then ended right, and nobody could ask a question, of course, which was not ideal, but still, you know, that sort of it. Now, I don't think Luker was like that, because he was being very Socratic and
Right.
getting, but still, you know, that that's sort of decayed, and I guess this idea that you said, you're not giving, we think we're giving the students information, and he doesn't think he's giving the students information. Maybe we don't all think that too, so.
Wonderful. Maybe the last thought you want to share with us? Anything particularly standing out about Blucher or Arendt that you come across that you just need to?
I think my last word was the way in which I see them as a, maybe not completely on eye level, but, and yet I think they were very involved with each other's work.
And in a more equal way than many other creative couples. Is that, I don't want to say that if that's not what you think, but.
No, I think more in the way that she did not look down on him.
Yeah.
That they took an interest in an equal way, they took an interest in each other's work, and which is why it's so amazing that the same terms come up during that decade, 1949 to 58. Very similar terminology. That's not a coincidence.
I'll say this, because I run the Hannah Arendt Center, I get emails all the time from people about this or that. And I would say almost monthly, you get one like, I have discovered that actually Hannah Arendt was influenced by, Machiavelli, and she's a Machiavellian, or she's a Platonist, or this. And it's just something that's very annoying to me, because I think Hannah Arendt was a unique thinker, and all these people want to sort of find the sort of canonical figure that she's just a representative of and deny this. And a lot of people come and say, I want to work with Hannah Arendt and Blucher, and I have a similar issue in my own head about this, right? On the one hand, yes, I think they were clearly a creative couple. I think they had a great intellectual and as well as emotional and spiritual relationship. And I'm just always interested in what are we trying to find? Are we trying to find the source of Hannah Arendt in her husband?
Definitely not.
No, right. Yeah, no, I know you're not. And so I just want to hear, what got you, how do you think about that issue? Because so many people want to, in a sense, find her source in some canon or male or other figure. That's not what you're doing.
Definitely not.
So how do you imagine, within that context, as a response, your work?
Well, I think both of them were trying to find the various sources of our cultural tradition and how these sources respond to the current moment after these years of total breaks, gaps, and I think they did that in different ways.
Yeah.
And I would never occurred to me that either of them is a source. They were both in search of a future. I think both of them are very looking into the future, but also cleaning the house.
Yeah.
Cleaning the house of their personal history and the historical facts that affected them. So it's a great team. But
Yeah, great team, and into the future. I like that. Well, Barbara, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun and really interesting, and I look forward to seeing where the work leads. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.